Let's give a warm Pachyderm welcome to Mr. James Franko. So every night when we get home and we're sitting down for dinner with my wife and kids, we do roses and thorns, right? You get to say what was a good thing of the day, what was a rose, and what was a thorn. So tonight when I get home, I don't know if I'm going to say that giving David a hug and being hugged in turn was either a rose or a thorn, but I will have something to say that I got to hug a strange man today for the first time, and it was a life-changing experience. But when he was praying, he prayed that I would maybe offer something new or offer something by way of reminder to the audience. And on one hand, unfortunately, it's going to be a lot more of the latter, because the thing that Carl asked me to talk about was something that Carl has worked on for a long, long time when he was with the Kansas Taxpayers Network. It's something that people at this podium have said for years. It's something that KPI has been working on for a long, long time. And it's talking about the simple fact that the state of Kansas cannot spend more than it brings in. Right? This should not be a new revelation to anybody. Right? But unfortunately, that's where we sit, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. And it's a lesson that we've learned. We think back, we said Governor Collier is going to be here next week, right? It was when he was the lieutenant governor, when he was the governor, and we had the 2012 tax experiment, right? The Brownback tax experiment. And what we realized through that, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in just a second, is that you can't spend more than you take in. And that's ultimately why that failed. It's ultimately why the Brownback tax cuts were revoked. It's why we, in large part, have the governor that we have today. And even as she was vetoing bill after bill after bill of tax relief over the last couple of years, she said, we can't cut taxes too much, otherwise we're going to go back to Brownback 2.0. But the simple truth is that this is not, on one hand, unique to Kansas, but it shouldn't surprise anybody about how it is that we got here. So Carl mentioned it, Kansas Policy Institute. We were founded in 1996. George Pearson, Martin Eby, who I know is a regular Pachyderm attendee, were some of our founding board members. Paul Sutar worked for us at different points and has done a lot of work with us since and over the years. And our job is to go up and try to hold the people in Topeka primarily accountable for what they tell you on the stump, and then how they actually vote when they actually get to Topeka. And unfortunately, those two things don't necessarily match up. Our focus is on policy. We don't engage in electioneering. I don't say, hey, vote for this guy or vote for that gal or don't vote for that one. It's all about the policy outcomes that we focus on as a state. And as Carl said, a lot of that is education. Half of every dollar that we spend in the state is on K-12 education at the state level. And then the rest of it is on all the other different things. We're going to talk about three things today. We're going to talk about spending policy. We're going to talk about taxes and maybe where we've been over the last 18 months or so. And then ultimately, I want to talk a little bit about why those things matter. And with all due respect to my boss, Dave Trobert, who's a recovering accountant, it's not about the green eye shade kind of thing, right? It's more fundamental than that. So Kansas spends, does anybody want to guess how much we spend per resident, give or take? And anybody who's seen our green book can't answer this question.
General fund or all funds?
Take a pick. But the answer is we spend about $4,900 per Kansan in the state of Kansas. The states with the lowest tax burden, the 10 states with the lowest tax burden, spend just below $3,300 per resident. And all of those states, Kansas included, we're offering the same basket of goods, right? You've got roads, schools, safety net, all these different programs, but Kansas is doing it at just a shade under $5,000 per resident. And the states with the 10 lowest tax burden, so most of those states don't actually have an income tax, are doing it for $3,300 per resident. So it's not because Florida has beaches, it's not because Colorado has mountains, or because Texas has oil. Those states are making a choice to spend less. And then they're able to support that with lower tax rates as well. And what that means as a practical matter is that Kansas is the third most governed state in the country when you look at the total number of state and local employees. So there's only two states that have more state and local employees per capita than does Kansas. And if we think about total dollars, right, with state funds in 2019, we spent about $12.7 billion at the state level. I know I gave a pop quiz a second ago. Does anybody want to guess how much that was in 2024? That same number. And it's $18.4 billion. So $5.7 billion, billion with a B, worth of spending increases in the last 5 years. And no, that's actual dollars. We'll talk about inflation in just a second. And the reason that matters is because a lot of that was through the pandemic, but it was because the feds just poured money into the states. And it was money that we didn't need because we weren't facing any kind of real bankruptcy. Thankfully, the economy didn't tank like everybody thought it would in the spring of 2020. But now all that spending is baked in, even though it was federal money that was supposed to be one time. So in our school districts, in our cities, and our counties, and at the state level, we're seeing questions of, oh, well, you have to keep that money going because otherwise we're getting cut. We saw this at the beginning of the Obama administration when they did their stimulus package in, what would that have been, after the stock market crash of 2008, so in the spring of 2009. And spending was inflated by the feds, and then every time that one-time money that we all knew was going to be one-time ran away, all of those state and local governments said, well, you got to give us that dollar back. And it's like, well, we didn't give that dollar to begin with, and you knew it was going to be one time. You should have planned a little bit better. And the other side of that fiscal coin isn't just the spending, it's the taxes. And if we think back to where we've been over the last couple of years, Governor Laura Kelly has vetoed multiple tax plans. And each time, in one way or another, she has said, I'm doing this to keep Kansas fiscally sustainable. And if we don't veto this tax plan, and if we cut taxes too much, we're going back to Brownback 2.0. But over the course of those 18 months, the different bills that she vetoed, some of them were flat taxes, some of them went from 3 rates to 2, which is ultimately where we got in the special session this past June. But multiple bills that she would have vetoed, even if they had become law, we still would have had $2.5 billion in cash reserves by the time it was all said and done 4 years after they were enacted. So I don't know how having $2.5 billion worth of reserves constitutes wrecking the state's fiscal sustainability or whatnot, but she's one of many politicians who makes lots of claims that aren't really backed up with reality. And that gets us back to where we started. You can't cut taxes and not have the discipline to cut spending in any real meaningful way. And I think this is an important lesson for people to learn at the state level as well as at the federal level. It is easy to cut taxes. Everybody wants to run as a tax cutter. It doesn't matter if you're a Democratic socialist, a Trump Republican, or somewhere in between, right? Everybody wants to cut taxes. Very few politicians actually have the brass to go out and cut spending because it's harder. It's a lot harder to go in and say, we're going to limit this program, but we're going to do it by cutting taxes over here, and we'll let somebody else take care of cutting down the road because they can play gimmicks and games to cut taxes now and it won't hit revenue until later on. And like I said earlier from the Brownback experiment, or the Brownback experience, was when the state Supreme Court is telling you that you have to spend a certain number on K-12 education, it makes it very, very hard to engage in spending restraint. So whenever, if I may briefly, whenever any politician comes and knocks on your door over the next 6 weeks or what have you, and they want to talk to you about cutting taxes, say, okay, what program are you actually going to cut to make sure that these things are sustainable and you're not cutting my income taxes over here just to raise my property taxes or the sales tax or something else, some other place. And all of this is premised on the idea that legislators, the governor, are making choices. When Governor Laura Kelly was saying, we can't cut taxes because it's fiscally irresponsible, some of the difference between her tax plan and the legislative tax plan was only $50 million in differences in the plans. Now, I love soccer, right? That may be heretical to some of the people in this room. I love it. I watch it. My kids play it. We enjoy it. I played it as a little tyke. I wasn't any good, but that's not the point. The point is, if I want to go see the World Cup in 2 years up in Kansas City, I'm going to have to pay through the nose from my own pocket to pay for those tickets to go see the World Cup, right? In Laura Kelly's budget, there was $28 million to fund World Cup activity in the Kansas City area. So I don't know how she can, with a straight face, say this one tax plan over here is fiscally irresponsible because it cuts taxes more than I want, and at the same time say I'm going to spend $28 million of your money to help entice the World Cup or to help fund the World Cup's activities up in the Kansas City area. And those things are all about the choices that people in Topeka make. And there's a couple of other things that have come up over the last few years that I think are also worth pointing out. My family were also big Royals fans. We're excited for the last weekend of the regular season. If they win one more, they're going to make it to the playoffs for the first time in a decade. But again, those are choices that I make. I don't think Kansas taxpayers should be spending upwards of $3 billion to entice the Chiefs and the Royals to move from Kansas City, Missouri to Kansas City, Kansas. Right? We love going to the stadium. We were fortunate enough to take our kids there last week to watch the Royals lose. But we got on the Jumbotron and we got a foul ball. So that was success even if they lost. But the point is, those are choices that legislators are making, that our governor is making to give tax breaks in one form or another to the Chiefs, to the Royals, to Panasonic, to Integra, where we are subsidizing business, and then we're saying we can't afford to let each of you keep more of the money that you earn every day. And it's about the choices that our legislators make. So we gave $800 million to Panasonic to redevelop the Sunflower ammunition plant up in the Kansas City area. We gave hundreds of millions of one sort or another to Integra to build here in the Bel Air area, And in and of itself, those projects may be worthwhile for national security or whatever reason. But if they're worthwhile, then they should be worthwhile without government subsidies. They should be worthwhile without you and I paying for somebody else to build a factory to grow their business. How many people in this room have built and grown businesses yourself without either A, soliciting a handout from the government of one sort or another, or receiving one, right? And there's going to be a lot of hands that go up. And we shouldn't be giving money to something that comes with Super Bowls or World Series rings or something else any more than we should be giving money to any of you to grow your business. You should be able to make those decisions by your own wits, not because of government subsidies. So as a practical matter, and this is something where I've dogged on the legislature a little bit, but I want to give some support to one thing that they're doing over the last several months, and next Tuesday and Wednesday, I believe it is, in Topeka, is trying to revisit what that budget system looks like. For a long, long time, before Laura Kelly, before Sam Brownback, before Governor Kathleen Sebelius, every January, the governor would give a budget to the legislature and say, hey, this is what I think we should be spending on. Maybe at one point it was simply a placeholder. It was to talk about priorities. It was aspirational or whatnot. But now, with a part-time legislature and the governor obviously controlling the executive branch, what it means is that that is a baseline for every single thing that the legislature does or doesn't do that year. And at least when I think back to the civics education that I had, it was that the legislature was in charge of the purse. It wasn't the governor. Or the president, for that matter, at the federal level, right? I don't know that I necessarily trust a lot of legislators to make good decisions either, but I trust at least people who are responsible within districts, more directly in touch than a year-round governor, to be making those decisions. So Senator Ty Masterson, you should ask him about this when he comes here in a couple of weeks. Dan Hawkins, the Speaker of the House, authorized a special committee on budget process and development. And the answer, the short version is that it will allow, ultimately, if it is successful, for the legislature to be put back in the driver's seat of how the budgets are done. Because now the governor gives their State of the State address. The next morning, their budget director presents their budget to the two spending committees in the House and the Senate. And everything that is done for the rest of the legislative session, uses that as a baseline. So if the legislature is going to spend more money on a given program, you're going to read about it in the newspaper as legislature proposes to increase spending over governor's baseline. If they're going to cut spending, the headline is going to be legislature cuts 5% from governor's budget proposal on homelessness or education or whatever the topic may be. And maybe that's a good decision, maybe it's a bad decision, but it's a question about where do we want those decisions being made? And do we want them being made with a governor and an executive branch that is not accountable really to anybody for the bureaucracy itself? Or do we want those decisions, as imperfectly as they might be made, to be made by the legislature? And we're seeing this idea of legislative accountability and legislative work be in a variety of different ways. The REINS Act that the legislature passed this last year over Governor Kelly's veto will give the legislature the authority to review major rules and regs that come out of the executive branch. This shouldn't be earth-shattering, but it's important work and it's being done. So now the question is the executive branch going to kind of maybe cook the books a little bit to make sure that every regulation comes in just under $1 million, which is where the threshold kicks in, right? At the federal level, we saw the Chevron defense from the 1980s be overturned in Loper Bright by the US Supreme Court. And the progressives can scream and whine and moan about how that's horrible, but at the end of the day, all it tells the US Congress that they have to do is their job. That they can't simply pass vague legislation and enabling legislation. They actually have to say, this is what we want to accomplish, and put it in the statute itself, because the statute only gets you so far. Anytime a bill is passed, then you get into the regulatory environment, and depending on who the governor or who the president is, they get reinterpreted. And that doesn't lend itself to good decision making, nor does it lend itself to real stability for families, businesses to be able to go out and operate. So when it comes to the budget, we've got this special committee on budget process and development. For the last several years, KPI has talked about our responsible Kansas budget, which tries to implement a good rule on spending restraint to capping it at inflation and population growth. Now, over the last couple of years, that hasn't done us a lot of favors because inflation has been through the roof. But the idea is that you put a hard restraint to remove some of that discretion from legislators, because if there's money in the bank, the legislators are oftentimes, almost without exception, going to spend it. So it limits the growth in spending. It doesn't actually cut anybody. And like I said, if at the beginning, in 2024, the state funds budget was $18.4 billion. If we had limited that growth to population and inflation over the last couple of decades, it'd be $12 billion. So that's $6 billion that we either could have spent on other things if we wanted to, or back to where we started, returned it to more Kansans to be able to spend it where they want to. We've had performance-based budgeting on the books for a number of years, but nobody's implemented it faithfully. Neither the governors who have overseen it, nor when the Appropriations or the Ways and Means Committee have executive branch agencies come and ask for more money, do they say, okay, what are your performance-based metrics that you're supposed to have according to state statute? And we're only going to give it to you if you're actually meeting those numbers, right? And unfortunately, none of that has actually happened. And I made a crack about my boss being a recovering accountant a minute ago, but I think this gets to the absolute fundamental thing to remember when it comes to tax policy. This is not some green eye shade exercise where it's just about making spreadsheets balance and making sure that revenue matches expenditures or anything like that. It's about what each and every one of those dollars represents. And I know everybody in this room agrees with me. It's that each of those dollars represents an opportunity for you to make a decision for your family, right? You can save that money to invest in your business. You can send your kids to college. You can donate it to church. You can buy lunch at the Pachyderm Club, right? It is where that dollar is being spent and ultimately who's making that decision. So as important as it is to say government shouldn't live beyond their means, right? All of us know that here. Amen. It's what do those dollars represent? And those dollars, in a very cheesy and cliched kind of way, represent the American dream. And if I don't have one more dollar in my pocket, or if you don't have 10 more dollars in your pocket, then it means that those dollars are going to City Hall or the county courthouse or Topeka or Washington, D.C. for somebody else to make that decision about where that dollar is spent. That doesn't mean I'm always going to get it right? Maybe I shouldn't have gone to the Royals game last week, right? Maybe I should have done something else with that money. They lost, it was pathetic, but it was still a good opportunity for my kids. And it was a lot of fun. But it's about where those decisions are made. And it's about who do we trust to make those decisions. Because when we increase taxes or when we keep taxes artificially high, what we're implicitly saying is we don't trust Kansans to make those decisions for themselves. And a lot of progressives want to talk about being the pro-choice party or something like that. But what they're talking about is only in this very one important, but one area of life. They're not pro-choice when it comes to how you spend your paycheck. They're not pro-choice when it comes to how you say something or what it is that you say or what you believe. And they're certainly not pro-choice when it comes to how we educate our kids. And that gets to a host of other work that KPI does on a variety of different things. And Carl mentioned it. We spent a lot of our time talking about education policy. Just last year, we started the Kansas School Board Resource Center that exists to help local boards of education kind of drive achievement and drive decision-making at that local level. 5 years ago now, actually, we started the Kansas Justice Institute that sues government to stand up for the rights of individual Kansans. I spend a lot of my time with the Kansas legislature, like I said, trying to hold them accountable. I have to wear a little name tag when I go into the Kansas State House or whatever to make sure that everybody knows who I am and I'm not doing anything nefarious. But it's on a host of different educational and policy issues where KPI engages. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to speak. And I like questions as much as I do anything else. So I'm going to stop there, and I will answer questions on fiscal policy to the best of my ability, school of choice, which is my personal favorite issue, or anything else. I will do my level best to answer it. So, all right. Thanks, Gary.
So, we have questions now. We have quite a bit of time, but still try not to make statements and have questions, and maybe James can answer all those questions for us.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll start right here with Stephen.
No, I just don't know how to word it, but when you talk about bringing the Royals and the Chiefs here,
Yep.
Panasonic, Integra supposedly has promised 2,000 new jobs.
Yep.
That even if they're lying by 50%, if they bring in 1,000 jobs and 500 of that come from other places here in Wichita, but 500 are new jobs, doesn't that expand the tax base and make up some, if not all of that stuff that we're giving them up front in the beginning over the long haul?
Yeah, I think that is certainly the hope, right? That's the bet. That's what those companies are telling the policymakers who are giving them your money and my money. But I think this gets to what the economist Friedrich Bastiat called the seen versus the unseen. It's very easy to see those 500, let's assume that even if they're double what they said they were going to be, it's 2,000 jobs. It's easy to see those 2,000 jobs and say, look, great, this is good. We're creating 2,000 jobs. To your point, we're increasing the tax base. They come with families and they're going to invest in their communities and have ancillary jobs and all that kind of stuff. That's easy to see. What we can't see is what would happen if that money was left with other people to go out and expand their businesses themselves and not let somebody in Topeka make that decision for the state. And it's harder to see. This was one of the fundamental things with the Brownback era tax cuts, right? Was that we were giving lots of different businesses, lots of different families tax cuts in the hope and over the long term, and we saw this with some of the initial research, we just didn't have a chance to let it flourish in the way that we would have, because the tax cuts were were revoked in 2017, I believe it was we were starting to see more businesses start, businesses grow, and we've seen this in other states as well, where they have that lower tax burden, some of whom, Texas is one of the leading ones who gives away these kinds of subsidies, is that they're seeing more job growth because their overall tax burden is lower than states with higher tax burdens. So it gets to the idea of the seen versus the unseen. It is easy to see those jobs being created at Integra or Panasonic or the Chiefs Stadium if they move across state line or whatever. And that's what politicians like to talk about. Politicians of both parties. Nobody is exempt from this, right? But the question is, what happens if we leave that money where it belongs, which is in your pocketbook?
Hi, I'm Kathy Booty, and I was just elected to the Derby School Board in January.
My condolences.
Let's go to
Well, thank you, I guess, for that. Anyway, I have a huge learning curve when it comes to the budget. I felt like the timeline of when I got the budget laid out, and my time to study it and learn about it was about this wide.
Right.
And part of that was due, we had a change in finance directors, a death in the family. There were just
Right.
several things that went on. But should there be more time built in between when the or I guess what I'm asking is, when should the district have enough information for us to start looking at the budget?
Well, I don't think this is just a question for school districts either, right? At the state level, you've got a part-time legislature. I alluded to this earlier, right? In Topeka, the governor prepares their budget and they release it in the mid-January. And in talking with, Speaker Hawkins last year, they can't even get the actual spending of what was actually spent, not what was approved, until the governor releases it, which means that the legislature can't even do their job until the governor releases that budget. So then this gets to your fundamental question, right? To where between the state passing their budget, their fiscal year goes from July 1st to June 30th, and then you get the cities, the counties, and the school districts who are then, because of how much state money there is in those different entities, then their budget process goes through the summer, and then you're voting on things typically in July and August, right? And it is an absolute challenge, and it's one of the things that makes it hard to actually cut spending. Because you saw the budget book, or whatever you want to call it, the budget proposal is prepared by staff, and then it's given to the elected body, in your case, the school board, and you pretty much get a thumbs up or thumbs down, and very little opportunity to weigh into it. And that's where, for your particular case, we started the Kansas School Board Resource Center that operates to try to help individual board members think through these things in a longer term process. Because if you just started in January, like you said, and then you have to vote, several months later, you're between a rock and a hard place, right? And we've seen this especially through the revenue neutral rate notices and things like that have come out in the last couple of years, is what does that actually mean? And it's not an easy short-term process. So on one hand, I wish I had an easy answer for you and said, it should be September 1st, and then you should get your budget information in May 31st or whatever it is. But the hope is that over time, the reforms that I mentioned before with what this special committee is doing at the legislative level, or if you haven't, you're nodding a little bit about the School Board Resource Center, those kinds of things can provide answers that don't have immediate dividends, but hopefully then prepare you to make that decision in 2025.
I have attended their
Okay.
conferences and
Yeah.
their Zoom meetings, and
Right.
they have been helpful. But
Right.
it's a lot to learn all at once.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Okay, James over here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Franko, for coming up. My name is Ben Seymour. I'm the district committeeman here in District 228, Sedgwick County. The question I have is there an article describing the Brownback administration and the whole budgetary process and all of the, the kind of the associated drama and the aftermath of it, back and forth and all that? Because there's people on both sides that want to maybe not be interested in the truthful, picture. And is there something like a long form magazine article of some type?
I'll do you one better. We wrote a book on the subject called What's Really the Matter with Kansas? Learning from the Brownback Tax Cut Experiment. So grab me afterwards and I'll get you a copy. It's now several years old because we wrote it kind of as the Brownback era was waning. but it gets into this absolutely the fundamental truth that I mentioned. You can summarize it in a sentence. You can't cut taxes without cutting spending, or at least without restraining spending, right? And on one hand, it doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. On the other hand, to this lady's question, that's a lot harder to do in practice. So grab me afterwards, we'll send you that book. We've got videos on our Facebook and YouTube channel that also kind of go through that in bits and pieces that are eminently shareable on Facebook or Twitter or X or whatever we're supposed to be calling it these days. So that go through it point by point with reams of data and all that kind of fun stuff to talk about it as well.
When I was up in Topeka advocating for taxpayers, I learned quickly, obviously the number one rule in Topeka is 63, 21, and 1.
Right.
But corollary more recently to 84 and 27 supersede prior rule. My question ties into this in the sense that the legislature, and Kathy's earlier point, and all elected officials, if you don't get the budgetary information, it's hard to make good decisions under public scrutiny and everything coming at you anyway. But to try and do it under inadequate information is totally impossible. The legislature really doesn't get their true budget information until, in terms of revenue side, until the middle of April.
That's right.
Think about the idea of the governor presenting their budget and then basically sending the legislature home for a month or 6 weeks so that they don't use up all the legislative days fiddling around during winter in Topeka and saving them. So when they have their revenue figures, the final revenue figures they get in mid-April, and then put them to work from roughly April 15th till whenever they can pass a budget and adjourn. So that's my process question for you. And my second question is, I never tried to convince people to cut spending when I was a lobbyist for the legislature, except in a few rare cases when you're looking at the total budget. I just said, look, if you guys can, you've got revenue growing, if you can take half the revenue to make our tax system more competitive,
Yeah.
we could do away with the statewide property tax over maybe a decade at that time back in the 90s. But if you turn around and if you keep spending at 8%, you can cut that spending growth to 4%. I don't know if that makes me a moderate in KPI's world. I throw that out as just sort of trying to get my first corollary in terms of 63, 21, and 1. So if you have comments on that, I'd love to hear them. Thank you.
Okay, so every industry has its jargon, right? So when Carl says 63, 21, and 1, what he means is that it takes 63 votes in the House of Representatives to pass something. There's 125 members. It takes 21 votes in the Senate. There's 40 senators. And then 1 is the governor's signature, right? So to override a governor's veto on any legislation, doesn't matter what it is, you need 84 votes in the House and 27 votes in the Senate, right? That's what it takes for a supermajority to override the governor's veto. And this is a point, I was just reading an article a moment ago about the DNC spending money in Kansas to try to get rid of the Republican supermajorities in the Kansas legislature. And again, this is where the little attorney on my shoulder reminds me to say, KPI doesn't engage in electioneering. I'm not advocating for or against the election of anybody. But the question is, do we really care about supermajorities when those supermajorities don't actually vote in a way that they say they're going to vote? So on tax policy, and then I'll get back to your question, it just reminded me, Carl, so I apologize, is we had multiple legislators who voted for the flat tax at the beginning of the legislature. Laura Kelly vetoed it. Then when it comes time to override the veto, these are Republican members of the legislature who voted with Laura Kelly to not override her veto. And then tried to play games and say, oh, well, I voted for it here, but then I voted for it against it over here, as though that somehow gives them a pass, because we know what that really means, right? When their vote mattered, they weren't there to stand up for taxpayers. So on one hand, the question is, do those supermajorities matter when they're not actually voting that way on regulatory policy, on life, on taxes, on education, on any of those different things? So I think that's just important to keep in mind. Again, when somebody comes and knocks on your door and asks a question over the next 6 weeks, ask them very pointedly what their thoughts are on actually standing up for what it is that they believe in when they get to Topeka. On the budget process itself, on one hand, this is hilarious, right? The legislature meets from January to March. They take April off. They come back at the end of April or the beginning of May for their special session, or excuse me, their veto session. And Carl's absolutely right. The legislature kind of cools their heels. They go to a lot of receptions, a lot of dinners, all that kind of fun stuff for those first 3 months. Then at the end of March, they pass a budget, but everybody knows it's just a placeholder. We wait until revenue estimates come in after tax day. They figure out how much they have left in the bank or how much they're short. And then they actually go about, untying the Gordian knot that is the budget and tax thing, which also implicates education, until the very end of April or the very beginning of May. So your question, Carl, was whether or not we think the legislature should just take time off. Part of me says the less time they're there, the better. It just keeps us all out of trouble. But it's that everybody knows that a lot of what they're doing is just twiddling their thumbs until after tax day and after we get those revenue estimates. And then they say, okay, this is how much we have and this is how much we're going to spend. And even if you think we should be spending more, or even if you think we should increase taxes, which I know nobody in this room believes, right? If you're forcing all of those decisions, practically speaking, into about 2 weeks, that doesn't lend itself to good decision making, to good lawmaking. And at the end of the Sebelius administration, the state was actually delaying payments to school districts after the end of the fiscal year. Now, that's 16 years ago. On one hand, it doesn't matter, but to the question we had earlier about how this budget process works, if the legislature isn't making their final spending decisions until the end of April or the beginning of May, then county governments, city governments, school districts don't have any real certainty, although you can paint in broad strokes, about how that money is going to ultimately flow, and it makes the job of our local leaders, that much harder. So that's where I am hopeful that this special committee that the legislature authorized will get into those very topics so that the legislature is back in control. You're not sitting there twiddling your thumbs for 3 months and then coming back in May. So Vance Ginn, he's an economist who worked in the White House for a number of years. He's now doing some work with us. He's presenting to this committee next week in Topeka on the 2nd of October about these very topics, about how to reform the budget process on the process side of things that hopefully will ultimately lead to spending restraint in the future. And then to the last question that you asked, Carl, sorry, I'm filibustering and I'm not even in the Senate here, is nobody is actually talking about cutting spending in any real meaningful way. What we're talking about is, we heard bending the curve from Obamacare, right, 15 years ago as well. But what we're talking about is limiting revenue increases, or that when revenue increases over a certain threshold, that money is given back to taxpayers by way of tax cuts, and you start buying down, be it property taxes or the income tax or whatever it is. A number of states over the last couple of years are engaged in this process, moving to flat taxes, lowering their rates, and then saying, okay, anytime revenue increases over X percent, it's going to go straight into tax cuts. And that's exactly where we should be, so that nobody's actually talking about goring anybody's ox politically, because every dollar that's spent by the government has a very loud constituency behind it. It's about making sure that as revenue increases, that money's being returned to taxpayers, not put into the government kitty.
Okay, James, thank you, James.
No more? Well, we've got a few minutes. No more questions? Wait a minute. I see you've got a lot.
There's lots of questions, Carl.
Gary wants to goof off, I guess. Here we go.
Can you give us any talk about what may happen about changing the selection of the Supreme Court after the governor leaves?
Right. So right now, the way we pick the Supreme Court in Kansas is with the Judicial Nominating Commission. 5 of the members of that 9-member body are selected by the State Bar Association. And I don't know about you, but I love attorneys. And I'm sure they make great decisions about who they put on that commission, right? The other 4 members of that nominating commission are appointed by the governor. And that's in the Constitution. So on one hand, to your question, it has nothing to do with Laura Kelly or Sam Brownback or Ronald Reagan being the governor. That change has to happen constitutionally, which means that you get back to that 84 and 27, have to pass it through the legislature, and then it goes back to the voters to vote on how that Supreme Court nominating commission works, or ultimately, if there's even a nominating commission at all. Over the last several years, there's been a discussion about moving to the federal model, which is essentially gubernatorial appointment, Senate confirmation, which is what we have for our lower court justices in Kansas, the appeals courts, and many of the district courts, or going to the direct election of Supreme Court justices as well. I'm a fan of the federal model personally, but that doesn't necessarily account for anything. So to your specific question, on one hand, it doesn't matter who the governor is. The governor wouldn't get a legislative say on that because it has to be changed in the Constitution itself. It is not a statutory rule.
Okay, another question back
What is your opinion about star bonds, their performance versus their promise? They've been around quite a few decades. Where do they stand right now in terms of living up to the promises?
They don't. We did a study. There is a good professor at KU. His name's Art Hall. He works for the Brandmeier Center for Applied Economics up there, and he did a study for us looking at all of the different star bonds around the state. And most of them failed to live up to their promises. The one that did, and it was a very close call, was the racetrack up in Wyandotte County, right? But most of them don't actually drive growth. What we saw, especially from the one in northeast Wichita around K96 and is it Greenwich or Webb, right, is all it really did was shift existing demand around the city, right? So there's a Target there. There used to be one by Town East. That one's now closed, and we've got the big Target out on the east side, right? The city, or was it the county, it was before my time in Wichita, gave money for Gander Mountain to be down here, and then they were put out of business when we've now got a Cabela's and that Star Bond out in northeast Wichita as well. So we've got like the actual study where we looked at all of these different things all across the state. They don't really work. The only one that actually was even close, and it was a very close run thing despite the gobs of money that went to it, was the racetrack and the Legends and that up in Wyandotte County.
Yeah, you just about confirmed Stossel. He said that those arenas and things never pay off.
No, they don't.
And so my question is, I don't think it really pays to buy a company, i.e. the battery plant up in Kansas City. I think companies are going to go where the resources are for their company. My question is, do you have any study to show what happens when they try to buy these companies and does it pay off? Like for instance, Coffeyville, Independence, they bought 3 companies, came in for 10 years, $10 million contract. After the 10 years, those companies left.
Right.
So does it ever do any good? And do you have any study to show that it doesn't do any good to try to buy a company?
Right. On one hand, I think it was to what this gentleman over here said a moment ago. It's about the seen versus the unseen, right? We can see the plant, we can see the jobs, we can see the ribbon cutting, and the politician gets to put on the goofy hard hat and the fancy shovel and break dirt for the first time or whatever. What we don't see is what happens if you leave that money with the individual citizens as well. So there's a variety of different studies where we've tried to do these different kinds of analyses. One, we mentioned about the star bonds, that it just shifts existing demand. It doesn't actually grow demand. These aren't the attractor of tourism dollars or whatever that you typically are told. Nathan Jensen, he's not affiliated with KPI, although we have quoted his work extensively. At one point, he was at the Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City. He evaluated the PEAK program, which isn't buying a company per se, but if I'm getting where you're going, it gives the businesses 95% of the payroll taxes that they get to keep. Most of those site decisions of PEAK and HPIP and all these other things already would have happened. The company would have decided to stay or to expand or to move where they were going to move, even if they didn't get that subsidy. So there are a variety of different studies that exist that all prove that same point, but then it becomes not necessarily a question of economics per se, but a question of political economy. And I've not met a politician who doesn't love attending a ribbon cutting.
Okay, James, back over.
Yeah.
The Wichita School District 259 gets roughly $1 billion a year from the state. And the school board has recently passed a resolution or for a vote in February for the city of Wichita to extend a bond issue that is going to expire in, I think, 2026. Is that right? 2020? Oh, well, it's going to be retired. They want to extend the bond issue
Right.
to do improvements to the school. Have you done extensive studies on 259 and the $1 billion that it receives, and have an opinion on whether or not that bond issue is needed to extend the bond?
Right. So I don't have an explicit opinion on the bond itself. I am dubious of the idea that we need to extend a bond in order to close more schools, right? Which is ultimately kind of what they're talking about, like fewer and newer buildings or something like that is what they're alluding to. But the study itself is, we spend statewide, I don't know the numbers, I should have looked them up again before I came here on what Wichita spends, but on average, we spend about $20,000 per kid to educate a public school kid in Kansas. That includes the state money, the local money, and the federal money, right? And the study itself, again, on one hand, makes you want to pull your hair out simple, is that less than 1/3 of Kansas kids are proficient in math or reading. And those numbers, unfortunately, are worse in 259. So we're spending an incredible amount of money on our public schools, and we're just not getting the outcomes that any of us would expect or what we would demand. And as hard as that number is to kind of just get your head around, the thing that's almost more tragic is that low-income kids are 2 to 3 grade levels behind those numbers. And that doesn't matter if it's 259 or Derby or anywhere else. Lower income kids are 2 to 3 grade levels behind their higher income peers. Minority kids are 2 to 3 grade levels behind white kiddos. And we wouldn't accept that if it were our own kids, right? And we shouldn't accept that when it comes to K-12 education as well, which is why almost everything that we talk about educationally comes back to the idea of educational choice. And that the people who are best equipped to make those decisions on behalf of a kid are their parents or their guardians, right? If they don't have parents. Doesn't mean that I'm always going to get it right with my kids. Heaven knows I'm going to screw up before the end of the day with them countless times. I probably did this morning before I left for the office. But it means that I'm the one who puts them to bed every night, and I should be the one making the decision about where they go to school. And we have school choice in Kansas. We do. For the families that can afford it, right? You can choose to move to a different public school district. You can choose to educate your kids privately. You can homeschool them, which is what we've been fortunate enough to be able to do. But not every family can afford that. So that was a very long-winded way of saying, ultimately where we're getting, whether it is this bond issue or the next bond issue, or when they come back in the legislative session and ask for more money for K-12, it has got to ultimately be about trusting parents to make those decisions for their kids and drive school choice so that families can make those decisions for themselves, not be shackled into a zip code directed school.
Tagging on to what Dave was saying here, this $450 million bond issue that we're talking about started out as a result of a shortfall of $42 million. So the $42 million, I mean, what a feat, basically. 42 million turns into 450. And one of the real thing, the school board superintendent talked about how student achievement has increased in USC 259. Is that true?
I don't think that last part is true. All of the numbers that we see based on the ACT college readiness exam, the NAEP, which is the National Assessment for Educational Progress, or the state assessment that every public school building in the state, every public school kid in the state is supposed to take, is showing that achievement is not increasing And if anything, it is decreasing, especially since the pandemic and schools were kept closed way, way, way too long. And the interesting thing about that shortfall is that it wasn't because funding was cut. It was because families chose to send their kid to a different school. They either moved out of the district, they decided to homeschool, they decided to send their kids to a private school. We started doing some interesting work with micro schools and hybrid education and all these different kinds of things where there's just all this innovation taking place. And the simple truth is that public school enrollment is decreasing, not just in 259, not just in Kansas, all across the country, right? And there are long-term demographic reasons for this. People are delaying starting families, they're having fewer kiddos, and we're way overbuilt in a lot of infrastructure because families used to be a lot bigger than they are now. And that's only going to accelerate over the coming decades. And again, this is not just unique to Kansas, right? And then through the pandemic, we saw this acceleration of these ongoing trends that families are demanding customization and individual educational opportunities. They don't just want to send their kids to the zip code directed school. They want the freedom to send their kid where their educational needs are best met. And that may be different for each individual kid. So to the fundamental point, it's these two questions. This is where we're going, and it's only going to continue over the decades to come. And we can pass all the bond issues that we want, right? But if we don't get our head around the idea that the money should follow the kid to whichever school or homeschool or micro school that they want to go to, then we're just going to be throwing more money after something that ultimately isn't being utilized by citizens themselves.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.